It's June 5th, 1956. Millions of Americans are sitting in their living rooms, gathered around the warm glow of their television sets. The Milton Berle Show is on. The host makes the introduction, and a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, walks onto the stage. He has a curl in his hair, a sneer on his lips, and a guitar slung over his shoulder. His name is Elvis Aaron Presley. He is 21 years old, and in the next 3 minutes, he will commit what the press will call an act of obscenity on national television. He will not fire a weapon. He will not utter a single bad word. He will not touch another person. All he will do is move his hips. That was the night America stopped being innocent, and Elvis was the one who pulled the curtain down. But the real story is not about a hip swing. It's about fear. It's about race. It's about the desperate attempt of a generation to hold back a tide that was already coming. And it's about one man who, knowingly or not, became the symbol of a revolution. To understand why Elvis's performance on the Milton Berle Show detonated like a bomb, you first need to understand where he came from, and more importantly, what America looked like in 1956. Elvis Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in a 2-room shotgun shack in Tupelo, Mississippi. His twin brother, Jesse Guerin, was stillborn. From his very first breath, Elvis carried both life and loss inside him. His family was desperately poor. His father, Vernon, drifted between odd jobs. His mother, Gladys, worked whatever she could find. They were the kind of poor that didn't allow for dreams, just survival. But Tupelo, despite its poverty, was alive with music. Not just one kind of music, all kinds. White gospel in the churches on Sunday mornings, black blues pouring out of the juke joints on Saturday nights, country drifting from the radio in the afternoons. Young Elvis absorbed it all like a sponge, unconsciously crossing a line that most white boys of his time never dared to approach. When the family moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1948, Elvis was 13 years old. Memphis was a city divided by a brutal racial fault line, but its music was not. Beale Street, the beating heart of Black American culture in the South, was only a short walk from where Elvis lived. He would wander there alone, listening, absorbing, learning, not as a student, but as a boy, deeply, instinctively moved by what he heard. In 1954, a young producer named Sam Phillips at Sun Records was looking for something he described as a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel. He believed that combination would make $1 million. He found Elvis Presley. On July 5, 1954, Elvis walked into the studio and during a break in a session that wasn't working, began noodling around with a raw, unpolished version of That's All Right. Phillips hit record. Something was born that night. But Elvis was not simply a product of calculation. He was a product of collision. A young white man who had genuinely lived alongside black culture, who had been shaped by it, who moved his body the way the musicians he admired moved theirs. When he stepped onto a stage, everything he had absorbed came out of him at once. The music was real, the movement was real, and that, more than anything, is what made it dangerous. He wasn't performing black music. He was carrying it inside him, and that terrified the people who needed the line to stay. By early 1956, Elvis had already released a string of singles and was becoming a sensation on the touring circuit. Teenage girls screamed until they fainted. Boys slicked their hair back and tried to imitate him. And parents, preachers, and politicians were beginning to pay very close attention. The time bomb was ticking. It just hadn't gone off yet. The Milton Berle Show was one of the most watched television programs in America. When Elvis appeared on it for the second time on June 5, 1956, an estimated 40 million people were watching. To put that in perspective, there were about 168 million people in the United States at the time. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans had their eyes on the same screen that night. Elvis had performed on television before. He had appeared on the Dorsey Brothers stage show, on the Perry Como show. The Screaming Girls were already a feature, but those performances had been relatively contained. He played his guitar. He moved around. He was exciting and different, but not yet fully unleashed. That night on the Milton Berle Show, something shifted. The song was Hound Dog, a blistering piece of rhythm and blues originally recorded by Big Mama Thornton in 1952. When Elvis launched into it, the studio audience erupted. And then, midway through the performance, he did something unexpected. He set down the guitar. He grabbed the microphone stand. He slowed the music down to a grinding, deliberate crawl, and he began to move his hips in slow, deliberate, unmistakable circles. The girls in the studio audience lost their minds. The screaming was so loud it nearly drowned out the music. But in living rooms across America, in the houses of parents and grandparents, something else was happening. Jaws dropped. Hands flew to mouths. People turned to each other with looks of disbelief. Some reached for the telephone to call the network and complain. The press the next morning was merciless. The New York Times called the performance Tin Pan Alley rubbish. A television critic wrote a column calling Elvis unspeakably untalented and vulgar. The word used most frequently in reviews and letters to the editor was the same one, over and over, obscene. Ed Sullivan, the most powerful man in American television at the time, announced publicly that he would never book Elvis Presley on his show. "He is not my cup of tea," Sullivan said. It was a statement of cultural war. Sullivan represented mainstream, respectable American entertainment. Elvis, in that moment, represented everything it feared. They called it obscene, but what they really meant was, this belongs to them, and you are bringing it into our living rooms. Within days, parents' groups were organizing protests. Church leaders were delivering sermons about the moral corruption of youth. Police departments in cities across the South announced they would arrest Elvis if he performed his vulgar moves at upcoming concerts. In San Diego, officers actually stood in the wings during his show with cameras ready to document any lewd behavior as evidence. The machine of American respectability had looked at Elvis Presley and decided he was a threat. They were right. He was, just not in the way they thought. The outrage about Elvis's hip movements was real, but it was not the whole story. To understand what was truly at stake in the summer of 1956, you have to look at what was happening in America beyond the television screens. The United States in 1956 was a nation in the grip of racial tension. The Supreme Court had ruled in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott had begun in December 1955 and was still ongoing. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and the white establishment, particularly in the South, was fighting back with everything it had. In this context, a young white man moving his body the way black musicians moved their bodies was not just a matter of taste. It was a political act. Not because Elvis consciously intended it that way, but because the cultural enforcers of the time understood perfectly what it meant. If a white boy from Mississippi could absorb black music, black movement, black feeling, and stand on a national stage and be worshipped for it, what did that say about the entire system of racial separation that the South had built its identity on? The Reverend Billy Graham, the most famous evangelist in America, said that Elvis represented a profound change in the moral fiber of the nation. White supremacist groups called rock and roll a means of pulling the white man down to the level of the Negro. The language was vile, but the fear behind it was transparent. The walls between the races were cracking, and music was the wrecking ball. What made Elvis uniquely explosive was that he could not be easily dismissed. He was white. He was from the South. He spoke with a Southern accent. He loved his mother and went to church. He called adults sir and ma'am. By every external marker, he was a respectable young white man, but his music came from the wrong side of the tracks, and his body knew it. That contradiction was impossible to contain. He was everything they wanted to protect, and everything they were afraid of, in the same body, at the same time. Meanwhile, the black artists whose music had inspired Elvis, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Big Mama Thornton, watched from the sidelines as a white performer became famous singing in their tradition. It was a story America had told before and would tell again. The culture was taken. The credit and the money went elsewhere. The irony was sharp. Even as white America condemned Elvis for being too black, black America often noted that he was being celebrated for something he had taken from them. Elvis himself never spoke about race in political terms. What is beyond argument is that his success opened doors that had been locked, doors that the music industry had nailed shut. After Elvis, the gates could not be closed again. The music was out, and it would not go back. Ed Sullivan had said he would never book Elvis Presley. He kept that promise for exactly 3 months. By September 1956, the ratings pressure had become impossible to ignore. A rival show had booked Elvis, and the numbers had been staggering. Sullivan, the great gatekeeper of American respectability, swallowed his pride and made the call. Elvis would appear on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 times for a then unheard-of fee of $50,000. The most powerful man in television had blinked. But Sullivan was not entirely without weapons. For Elvis's first 2 appearances, the cameras were allowed to show him in full. The reaction was enormous. 60 million viewers, the largest television audience in American history to that point. Letters poured into the network, some in outrage, many more in adoration. The cultural battle was playing out in real time, one mailbag at a time. Then, for Elvis's 3rd appearance on January 6, 1957, Sullivan made a decision that would pass into legend. The cameras, he decreed, would show Elvis only from the waist up. The hips that had caused so much scandal would be invisible to the audience at home. It was a compromise born of desperation. Bring in the ratings, but contain the danger. Show the phenomenon, but not the threat. The effect was the opposite of what Sullivan intended. By trying to censor Elvis's body, he had announced to the world that Elvis's body was dangerous. He had put a spotlight on the very thing he was trying to hide. Teenagers who might not have thought twice about a hip swing now understood that adults were afraid of it. And if adults were afraid of it, they absolutely had to see it. The camera cut away, but everyone already knew what was happening below the frame. That was the point. That was the power. The phrase, "from the waist up," entered the language as a shorthand for censorship, for the gap between what authorities allow and what actually happens, for the futility of trying to stop a cultural force with a camera angle. It became one of the most resonant images in the history of American television, the attempt to contain something that had already escaped. Elvis went on to make 33 films, sell over 1 billion records, and become, by almost any measure, the most famous entertainer in the history of the world. He died on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42. The boy who had shaken the nation had been consumed by the machinery that celebrated him. But here is what endures. Every time a musician takes a stage and moves their body freely, something of that June night in 1956 is in the room. Every time a television producer tries to cut away from something that makes the audience uncomfortable, Sullivan's ghost is in the edit. Every time a generation of young people finds its own music and its own movement, and the generation before it panics, that is Elvis, still working, still moving, still from the waist up. On June 5, 1956, Elvis Presley moved his hips on national television. Within 48 hours, half of America wanted him arrested. Within 6 months, they couldn't get enough of him. The scandal was never really about a hip swing. It was about who owned culture, who got to define decency, and whether the walls between people, racial, generational, social, could hold. They could not. They did not. Elvis was just the crack in the dam that let the river through. The revolution he represented is still ongoing. Every generation has its own Elvis, its own figure who moves too freely, sounds too strange, comes from the wrong side of the tracks. The pattern never changes. The panic is always the same, and the music always wins. They pointed the camera away, but the whole world was already watching. Now it's your turn. Did Elvis change music? Or did music change Elvis? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us, who is today's Elvis? Who is the artist right now that makes adults nervous? The one that the establishment is desperately trying to look away from? If this story moved you, share it. Someone you know needs to read it. Follow for more stories that history forgot to tell.